All right, Scott. Well, first, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks. So happy to be on the show with you.
So, curiosity, obviously a big component of this show. And I have to ask you this, which is, do you think you could actually, let me rephrase this. Do you think you can teach people to become more curious?
Yes, totally. I think
Okay.
yeah, I mean, it's a muscle, right? Just like many other things, like the muscles in our body, right? Curiosity is something that can be strengthened over time and with practice.
Mhm.
And, a lot of folks just don't know how to, they're like, I know, I see the benefits of it, or I see people around me who are really curious, or when someone's curious towards me, I feel really heard or seen or valued by this person. I feel like I matter to them. Or I see curious people really, they're happy, they're like active and engaged. I think about those elders that are like, don't ever give up on curiosity, even into these ages. Like, that's what keeps you alive.
Yeah.
But folks then have the question of, okay, but like, how do I do that? It's not enough to just say, be curious,
Right.
That was like me in a weightlifting gym for the very first time with my partner. He's like,
Uh-huh.
like really strong dude and like knows how to weightlift. And I was like, which one? Like, well, what do I use? Like, how do I put this on the bar? I don't even know
Yeah.
how to like move it. So we
Right.
need that sort of structure or that regimen or, a set of exercises that can help us to actually, you know, work out that muscle.
So that makes sense. And what you're highlighting for me is a a difference in perspective about where the person, this person we're speaking of, where they start. And I'll tell
Yeah.
you what I mean by that is
Yeah.
when you said, yeah, I think people can learn to be curious. Um, there was this assumption there that they see the value in
Mm-hmm,
curiosity.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
In
mm-hmm.
where what I have found is that perhaps it's less difficult to teach somebody how to be curious than it is to explain to them why curiosity is a value that they might want and
Mm-hmm.
convince them that it's worth the effort.
Right. The effort and the time. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean, and I think a lot of that is because people have a limited definition or understanding of what curiosity is. They're like, oh,
sure.
it's about learning about how much Beyonce made on her Renaissance tour. Like isn't that like curiosity? Like I'm wondering something, and that's a part of it.
Mhm.
It is this intellectual tool. But I think, you have kids, and for folks out there listening who have kids, I think, you can really connect to curiosity in a different way when you watch, your child, if they are verbal, they're using their curiosity to, explore their vocal anatomy, and they start babbling. They're like, bah, wah, ah, and
Mhm.
they're like seeing how people react to them. And it's just like this wondrous thing. I mean, it brings wonder and awe in my, eyes and my perspective when I watch that happen.
Mhm.
And, over time they construct words and they construct sentences and they start to communicate as these like full bodied people. And that's all powered by curiosity. I mean, that's a big part of it is learning and growth and development. I mean, we've needed that since we were ancestors. We
Mm.
needed someone to, wonder, how do we make chocolate? Like what, someone had to figure that out, or how do we
Right.
make a fire? Or, is there water in, on the other side of that mountain? Or where can we find food? Can I eat this mushroom? Like all of that is powered by curiosity and it helps us to learn and grow. And that's one part of it, intellectual curiosity. That's what folks call it.
Mhm.
But, I really love taking the idea of curiosity from the mind into the heart and seeing it as this heart-centered tool for connection. And that's when I think people really start to be like, ooh, like they lean in, they're like, oh, tell me more. That's interesting. I've never heard curiosity in that way, heart-centered curiosity. And
Yeah.
it's that, like I said, that type of curiosity when someone's really interested in who you are, like you're on a date and they're like leaning in, they're asking you questions and they're like, oh my gosh, like I want to learn more about that. They're genuinely interested in who you are, what you care about, what you're thinking. Even if you're not even dating, you're in a marriage of like 15 years, to feel
Yeah.
that from someone is so affirming. It's such an enjoyable, pleasurable feeling. And it makes you feel, like I said, like you're valued and that you matter.
Mhm.
And when you don't have curiosity, when someone is incurious towards you and they're dismissing you and they're like, whatever, you don't know what you're talking about, or I'm certain about everything, I know everything, I'm not interested in your perspective, that's when we kind of feel a little bit, erased or dismissed or ignored, and that's a shitty feeling. That's not a great feeling.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so, we don't want to, many of us, are compassionate, kind humans that want to do right to the people we love. And so I think when folks understand that curiosity powers that love and that connection, that's when folks really get the benefit. And they're like, okay, wait, I'm ready. How do I do this?
Okay, so I can see a clear distinction between those two types of
Yeah.
curiosity.
Yeah.
And the intellectual curiosity, obviously one that we focus on here. And I think more of the mental space that is taken up in my mind is with that intellectual curiosity. The
Mm-hmm.
difference and what I'm interested in understanding is when you talk about the heartfelt curiosity or the heart-centered curiosity, to be literal to
Yeah.
an extent. I mean, it's not literal, but how what's the difference? Like, how does it come from there instead of the intellectual part of just understanding something else?
Yeah.
You know
Well, I
what I
think for
mean?
me, yeah, it's the difference between knowing something and understanding someone, right? I mean, that to me is what the difference is. I literally, for me, in an embodied way, feel warmth in my heart, like in my
Mm,
chest, when I'm actively getting curious towards someone and learning things about them that maybe I never knew. Everyone has a story, of their grandpa like bringing them all together around the sofa and telling these stories from them growing up, and you're this kid and you're realizing, wow, like my grandpa or my parents like had this rich life outside of them just caring for me. They're this whole full-bodied person with all of these interesting insights and stories that they've experiences they've had in the world. And so I think it's literally an embodied feeling that you have
mm,
when you feel that connection towards someone, that you don't always feel, when you're only intellectually curious. You might feel a
right.
little satisfied, like, oh, I'm glad I got the answer to that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
But it doesn't give you that sense of, wow, like I really feel so connected to this person. I love this person more. I understand them more. They understand me more. I feel so heard and seen. I feel like I matter. Like that is a totally different texture,
Mm.
that curiosity gives you when it's heart centered.
And we before we hit record, we were talking about, you've been doing this type of work for about 5 years. Um, would you say that your focus or your interest in curiosity comes from the impact it has on human connection, or is that
Yes.
just a part of it?
Oh, that's my lane. Like that's like, yeah,
Okay.
I mean, and there's other lanes, around curiosity, but for me, I look at the world and I see, wow, we are so divided. We are
Hmm.
so polarized as a country in the United States and also globally,
Hmm.
and, we're fighting in parent teacher conferences. We're banning and burning books. We're yelling at each other at family reunions, Thanksgivings, Christmas. It's an election year in 2024. We're worried, am I going to be able to sustain this relationship with my sibling, my uncle, my nephew, whoever it is that has a different political view from me? And even outside of the political arena, there's intergenerational strife and conflict. Okay, boomer, entitled millennials, what do you know? You're old, you're young, there's all of this division across age, across faith. I mean, we're really feeling that with the geopolitical crises that are happening across our country and our world.
Hmm.
I was there, I think it was in a couple of months in the Seattle area. There was a church and a mosque that were burned by arsonists, and at the same time you have intersectional issues where like queer folks are trying to be spiritual in religious spaces but are being met with ostracism and stigma and hate. And so it's just like anywhere you look, you can't throw a pebble and not hit some kind of division or hate. And
Mm.
I'm all, that's what's been driving me my whole life, because I've been on the side of feeling what it feels like to be othered,
Got
to
it.
feel like, wow, everyone else around me, has a dad that's like present in their life. Like, where is mine? I'm struggling to understand why my dad is in prison, and like, what does that mean for me? He's a good man, but like, how do I reconcile that? And how do I reconcile my own life as a young person, or as a queer person?
Hmm.
Wow, like, why is it that I feel so much shame and so much self-hatred because people are telling me that my sexuality is sinful or not right, or and so I felt ostracism and felt othered by my identities or my ideologies or, the people in my family,
Mhm.
and the ways that that stigma can actually hurt in
Mhm.
psychological and physical ways, I would
Mhm.
argue. And I don't want people to feel that way ever, but when you look out
Yeah.
at the world, like I said, if you voted in a different way, or if you have a different identity that someone doesn't quite understand, it can lead to that hate, and it can lead to that sort of that vicious, I would say, even vicious, feeling of self-hatred and shame and all those other things that we want to move away from. So
Right.
curiosity is really the answer to move away from that.
It's a really interesting approach, and I'm glad we've kind of gotten to this foundation
Hmm.
early on. So it's would you say, and if people listening are going, Chris, yeah, you've now said it 3 times. I just like to make sure I really
Yeah.
understand something before I can dig in. Is it fair to say that your experience showed you the pain of feeling othered, and
Hmm.
so then you recognize that um, the way out of that almost is to understand each other, and then the best way to understand each other, and not just from I know who you are, but I know you, is
Hmm.
through a heart-centered curiosity, and that
Yeah.
brought you to kind of this concept. Is that I know a brief summation, but does that sound
Yeah,
about
I
right?
think that's totally right. And I think that when we other people, it really comes from a lack of understanding. And the more we can use our curiosity to understand them, what I found in my experience and what the research shows is that we feel closer to people. We feel more connected to them. Those feelings of hate decrease. Even with my dad, for instance, I had my own stigmas and stereotypes about what it means for someone to go to prison. And as I grew older and was an adult and actually volunteered and worked alongside folks who have been incarcerated or impacted by the justice system, my view of my own dad changed, and like,
Mm,
wow, like this is also a system and a society that failed him and failed our family, And so,
yeah.
I just, and I start to, head towards paths of like forgiveness and reconciliation. Unfortunately, he died shortly after he came out of prison, because prison is extremely hard on your body.
Right.
And, he just, developed illnesses that I think is also a product of his, addictions that he suffered
Mhm.
from. But, that's something that I've really learned, that, when we when we actually can work towards understanding someone in a deeper way, our feelings of hate are decreased. And there's something in psychology called contact or exposure therapy, which is basically when you're afraid of something like snakes, you
Mhm.
can come into contact with it in a regimented way that allows you to reduce your feelings of anxiety and fear. So you might, in the case of snakes, you might think of a snake in your mind. You might draw a picture of a snake. You might see a photo of a snake next. And then
Mhm.
you see a snake behind a glass wall until eventually, maybe with a non-poisonous one, you're going to hold the snake, and as you get closer and closer, your feelings towards, this creature change, because you're coming into contact with it. And hopefully you get to a point of exploring why you even have that fear in the first place. Like, who told you to be afraid of snakes when they're so important, in many
Mm.
cultures. They're so important for our ecosystem, and they're not as scary as like we've been told that they are. And,
Right.
just replace snakes with anyone that we fear, groups of people, especially who we consider as this monolithic, group, whether it's some people who vote for Trump, or people who are Christian, or people who are from the South. We make these grand sweeping generalizations, and we stigmatize people
Mhm.
because we think these group identities, are something that everyone, they're not one box, that you can put them all in. Just like there's many kinds of snakes,
Yeah.
yeah.
You know what's interesting as I'm thinking about this, right? When you started this conversation, you mentioned kind of the children and their curiosity, and I started thinking about, yeah, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that curiosity is so deeply ingrained in us. It could
Hmm.
potentially be one of the most critical components of being human, because without it, um, I mean, technically without it, I don't know if you could survive from a evolutionary perspective. If you think
Yep.
about it, right? If you weren't curious in what kind of response am I get, what happens when I knock this over, what happens when I touch the hot stove,
Yep.
etc. Right?
Yep.
So, with that evolutionary basis, there's also the one of tribalism, right, and
Mm.
bias, and the and this might be a controversial take, but like the value in bias, right?
Mm,
Of allowing me to make quicker decisions and not have to consciously think about everything.
yeah,
And I know
yeah.
your book and your work, you talk a lot about the research. What are your thoughts on this kind of this balance we're trying to play between our innate curiosity, but also our evolutionary tribalism that almost encourages us to not be curious about other?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it comes from that fear and that anxiety, right? That we feel towards the quote unquote the other. But when we really start to get to know people, like I did, I went on a 12-month road trip in my Prius, which is such a California cliche, but I like went to Trump rallies and I went to Republican meetups, and I'm extremely queer, extremely progressive. I didn't hide anything about who I am.
Right.
I can't hide being Asian, but, I could have, not shared that I was progressive, or not shared that I was from San Francisco, which, evokes a
Yeah.
lot of images for people. But, that's not something that I wanted to do, because I wanted to be honest about who I was. And so many of my friends were so worried for me. They said, you should bring a gun, you should bring a knife, pepper spray, like something to defend yourself. And, but instead what I brought was my curiosity. And I came from this heart-centered place, and I would go up to people in line at this at a Trump rally, and I'd say, I'm hearing a lot about who you are, not from you, from the news, from other people that have not met you. And I know as a storyteller, I've been a storyteller my whole life, that the best place to get a story is from the person themselves. And, we got 6 hours waiting in line together to see Trump speak. Like, I'm wondering, like, would you be open to having a conversation? Because I
Yeah.
really want to get to know who you are,
Right.
and what you care about and what your values are, and maybe what I'm misunderstanding or what the news is misunderstanding about you. And when you come from that perspective of genuine heart-centered curiosity, people were so surprised in a
Mhm.
delightful way. They were like, whoa, you're a progressive and not attacking me for who I'm voting for, as the first thing you say to me. You're
Right.
actually wanting to get to know me. And, I'll be clear, like, I don't agree, and we did not
I want to get
agree
into
on a
this.
lot
Yeah.
of things,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because curiosity isn't about agreement or
Of course.
consensus even.
Of
It's
course.
really about understanding,
Hmm. Hmm.
And the other interesting thing is that when I became curious towards them, it also encouraged them to get curious back towards me. So I could share some of my stories, and I could share
Mm.
what it means to be queer, and what I feel, is important to me as someone who's progressive. And the research does show that curiosity is contagious. When you start to be curious, towards others, they feel this sense of familiarity, this more friendly communal and likability towards you, and they're more likely to also be curious about who you are, and instead
Sure.
of coming from like the defensive. So it was an exchange actually where we got to learn a lot about each other. And I was shocked by how affirmed I actually felt at a place that everyone told me, I might get shot, or I
Right.
might get hurt, right? And it might be
Yeah.
different for other people.
Of course.
There's certain people who could not have done what I've done, and might have been physically threatened. And I did feel that on my road trip too. There was at least one case where I was physically threatened, but
Mm.
and that was at an Avett Brothers concert. So it wasn't even a Trump rally. It was like a very random situation, but with homophobic men who were
I don't
drunk.
know what the Avett Brothers, is that a
Yeah,
band or something?
The Avett Brothers.
Abbott? I don't know who that is.
Yeah, they're just like a folk band that's like all
Oh,
about love
okay.
and unity.
Oh,
And
gotcha.
so it
Okay.
was a weird place to feel hate, but
Yeah.
yeah, there was like a homophobic group of men that were drunk that were
Oh,
not happy with my then partner and I's, sort of affection that we were sharing.
I gotcha. I
But
gotcha.
I think, so we had to be like, this isn't a moment for me in that particular moment to be
Right.
curious. I wasn't like, okay, like, tell me why you're feeling this way. I want to learn about your pain and your suffering. No, I
Sure.
was like, okay, I'm going to move to a different aisle
Yeah.
because I don't feel safe right now.
Yeah.
So I do recognize my privilege of being able to go to this Trump rally and, be able to have these kinds of conversations. But I do think that curiosity really helped open people up for sure.
So we'll dig in more to the concept of curiosity, but now you got my curiosity sparked with this
Okay.
with these Trump rallies, because I got to tell you, one of my favorite things to watch is, you ever watch Jordan Klepper when he goes to these
Yeah.
things?
Yeah. Mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm,
mean,
mm-hmm,
come
mm-hmm.
on, it's just too good, right?
Yeah.
So, what were you surprised about, and what in your, I realize this is just your experience, what matched the, I don't want to say cliche, but was there anything that matched your expectations or met your expectations?
Well, I was going to say that, I don't know why I didn't think about this, but because I feel it on the Democratic side, but not everyone was like, 100% rah Trump. Like I think
Sure.
there was
Okay.
really
Yeah.
healthy dissent and things that they did agree with, didn't agree with. But overall, they respected him as the president and wanted to vote for him, for the next election. I think about, folks who are Democrats, like we don't always have 100% buy-in with our
Totally.
candidates either. So,
100%. Yeah.
and then the other piece is that not all Trump voters are at a rally. Some people don't want to be in that kind of environment. So I always had to
Right.
nuance my understanding of who's here, and and also understand that wow, like my image of who they are, my caricature of who they are is
Mhm.
so different. I have
Is
this
it?
character, yeah, I have this caricature like Jordan Klepper's
Yeah.
shows.
That's
that
my
they're
assumption.
uneducated, they're they don't know what they're talking about, they're not articulate, they're hateful, whatever it is,
Sure.
but I actually did not, I did feel that in some moments, but I did
Sure.
also not feel that in other moments. There was
Sure.
many people with advanced degrees, humanitarians, people who were actually down and okay and actually supportive of me being gay,
Mm.
folks who maybe they use different words but essentially agreed that climate change is real. That
Mhm. Yep.
that there's that, they might say conservation instead, but they have this care for the earth and don't want to put more carbon into the atmosphere, don't want air and water to be polluted. They're hunters and anglers.
Yeah.
So I was like, wow, just like there, two Christians aren't the same, two 40-year-olds aren't the same, two Asian
Yeah.
Americans aren't the same, two Trump voters aren't the same either. There's this
Yeah.
huge spectrum. And if I just believe what I see on Jordan Kepler, amazing
Yeah.
comic,
Yeah. Oh
but
my God. It's so
but if I'm
funny.
not critically thinking about, okay, who's producing that, like what are they trying to show me, what's their potential agenda. I don't think
Yeah.
Jordan, I don't know Jordan, I would
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
to have a conversation with him,
Yeah.
but I actually call this in the book predatory curiosity, where it
Mm.
looks like you're being curious, you're
Ah.
coming up with a mic
100%.
asking
Yep.
questions, you're leaning in, but there's an agenda, right?
Hmm.
Like you want to make someone look stupid, you want to it's like a gotcha moment. And
Yeah.
we all do this in small ways, even around like a family reunion, if we're arguing about something political, like we're like, see, you like fell into my trap, and here's what I'm going to tell you about why your point of view is wrong. But
Right.
that's not true curiosity, because that has an agenda and an ulterior motive. It's like what a detective or a prosecutor does.
Right.
True curiosity is truly open-hearted. I do not know what I'm about to find out. I do
Yep.
not know what I'm about to discover or experience, but my whole heart is open to it, and
Yeah.
I'm open to this experience.
Yeah. And what I like about that, what you were just saying there is, I think, look, I mean, let's say we watch Jordan Klepper. I know
Yeah.
that we're watching it through a fishbowl. I
Yeah.
realize this is all of that. And so we can say, or even in this conversation, I could
Hmm.
say to you, look, of course, I know people are nuanced in the same way that I might lean left, but to your point, there are plenty of, maybe not plenty, but there are right policies that I agree with and left policies I don't
Hmm.
agree with and all that. So I would expect the same in others as myself. I get that.
Yep.
But given what we digest, if it's the Jordan Kleppers or if it's the Fox News or it's this, that level of critical thinking, as you called it, although we know it's there, it might go away. And therefore, the more we do that, we
Yep.
subconsciously just create these black and white
Yeah.
biases, if you will, which
Yeah.
then lead to a lack of curiosity or understanding or connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And vice versa too, the lack of curiosity of being like, what else is out there? What else are people saying? Or, who are these people truly? I should meet them for my own self, to have
Hmm.
conversations with them and not just believe what other people are saying. And, because we all have biases and our own interpretations.
Hmm.
That curiosity fuels, that desire to know and to understand someone fuels your connection to them and cracks the bubbles and makes things more nuanced and more complicated. And so
Yeah.
I encourage and I invite people to do that. I think that's what we need more of, on our college campuses and our country, just generally. We need folks to to have this open-hearted curiosity, and that comes not from an agenda but from a place of really wanting to understand someone.
You said something there that is interesting. It's been a while since I've been in college, and it wasn't like this when I was in college. And I don't know even how much it is like this now or how much it's glorified. But um, the lack of willingness to understand multiple sides is, do you think that's a real thing? You know, you see these clips of people trying to you know, protest any speaker that comes into a university that doesn't fit their agenda, things like that. Do you think that's commonplace now, or that's
Yeah.
just highlighted?
Well, I think that for me, when I think about curiosity, and I read about this in the book, you also have to understand it from a perspective of power. Whose stories are being told or are being
Mm,
heard in culture all of the time.
mhm,
So who do we need to be more curious towards because they're not as present in culture or in the news or in social conversations?
mm,
So there's Amelia Bruneau, who was an amazing researcher, had studied this basically and had found that if you come from less social power, a group with less social power, it's more important for you to share, to actually perspective give.
mm,
And if you have more social power, it's actually more important for you to be curious and to
mm,
perspective take, to actually understand the perspective of someone else around you. And that came from his experience. Before he was a researcher, he was a high school teacher, and he would see these interracial dialogues, and white and white students and students of color would come together and they would have conversations. And then he would notice, wow, like white students, are getting something from it, but oftentimes students of color feel disgruntled or feel zapped of energy or feel like they didn't get much out of that at all, especially when
uh,
compared to white students. And he realized, oh, it's because we're trying to, create this all sides equal, everyone be curious towards everyone sort of structure. And what really needed to happen, and he tested this around many different groups that have different levels of power differentials, that when both groups will walk away feeling more satisfied and more connected to one another if you follow that direction. Less social power, you do more sharing. More social power, you be more curious. And I bring that into workplaces too, and into schools and into all the other places that I consult with. And we look at how are you actually structuring, the ways that you're listening to staff, who might have less social power than your faculty or administrators, or how, your entry level employees and interns who maybe have less power than your managers and your executives, right?
mm.
Who's really being heard in spaces. And that even happens in interpersonal spaces with friends and your family. We have to make sure that people who tend to not have their voices or stories heard, give them the stage and the platform to be able to, share their own stories. And then you might be the one that needs to be curious and to listen.
That's a great concept. I've never heard of it. It makes, at least on its face, so much sense. I don't know why though. Like what why why would that be the case? Any idea? I mean, it makes sense to me, but I just don't, other than the fact that it would make, maybe is it that it makes both parties ultimately feel better about the interaction,
Yeah.
right? Like,
And
so the
feel closer
higher
to
power,
the, yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm,
so the
mm-hmm,
higher power person gets to feel like, I learned about you, and perhaps um that's not an opportunity you're given very often, and so
mm-hmm.
I kind of open the space for you. And then the lower power person feels like I got to be heard and perhaps educate on
Yeah.
a different perspective.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of different reasons why
Yeah.
it happens. I mean, from my perspective, as I interpret and analyze that kind of, finding is, yeah, I think that's a part of it, what you just said, but also, this idea of being understood or
Mhm,
understanding someone deeply and
mhm,
being like, oh my gosh, I got it now. Like, I understand your story. I understand where you're coming from. And for that person too, to also feel understood, that their stories are being taken seriously, their perspectives matter, that their voice has worth and value. I mean, that is just such a wow, what a powerful experience and powerful sentiment to give to someone. And then again, it goes back to the culture piece that, some stories are heard more often in culture
right.
and others less so. So if you're constantly feeling like, wow, no one ever hears my perspective as someone who's trans or as someone who's black or someone, in these, lesser social power groups, which by the way, does not mean that they do not have joy. They do not have their own sense of
Sure.
power, don't have their own collective action and responsibility. It's just the system, is the way it's
Societally,
designed,
yeah,
yeah, and how
design,
it's
sure.
oppressing certain, groups of people. It can be frustrating to be like,
Mhm.
wow, now I have to sit in this room and listen to your story that I hear on Hollywood, on the news, like
Good
in
point.
every avenue of society. And
Yeah.
oh, look, we ran out of time and I don't even get to share my story. Cool. You know, like
Right,
that's a
right.
really frustrating experience for people
Mm,
and can drive negative emotions towards,
yeah.
another person or group of people.
So, this makes sense. It's a great I don't want to say spin. It's a great different perspective on curiosity, I think, than we hear and talk about often. It's also, I feel like, a lot more difficult to action against,
Hmm.
right? And here's what I mean. I think the idea of curiosity, one that, look, we talk about all the time on the show. I think it gets oversimplified on ask
Yeah.
questions,
Yeah.
have an
Agreed.
open mind, right?
Agreed.
And although that's true, that is almost impossible to do, right? And so then if we're doing it in the context of humans, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
not just information, then you add a whole other level of complexity. So where do you recommend, and I know you speak and you coach and all these things, where do you recommend people start
Yeah.
if they're saying, okay, listen, I do want to connect with others.
Yep. Hmm.
However, and I imagine this most people, I also have a lot going on in my world,
Hmm.
right? I
Hmm.
could be which I am, right? A straight white man with all the blah, blah, blahs, but there's still a lot of crap, you
Hmm.
know? So where do people start in the fact that they want to connect, but also recognize they have their things to deal with?
Totally. And I write this about this in the book. I call these speed bumps to accessing deep curiosity. You're talking about time, which is a big one.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma is another
Mm-hmm.
one. Fear is a really big one, and distance is another one. And I talk about it's almost paradoxical that, or it's almost like it's a catch-22 that we don't, for instance, have enough time to be curious. But if we are truly curious about, let's say inwardly curious about what matters to us, our emotions, how to better ourselves, how to better communicate to the people we love, that can actually free up so much more of our time, help us to focus our time on people that matter to us, on the things that bring us meaning in our lives. And so it's a tool of reflection. It's a tool of growth. And so, but we can get and stumble and prevent ourselves from even getting to that point of realizing these things about ourselves because we're like, I don't have time for that. When it could actually be this powerful tool that liberates you and brings more time to you. So I'll say that. And also that's why I brought a framework into my book, Seek, is because this is really hard. And people need that guidance. Like I said, a lot of people feel like, okay, I'm in the weight room and I don't know what to do, like I did,
Right.
So I have this DIVE model, DIVE. It's an acronym, and each of those letters stands for one of the core muscles that you can exercise to access what I call deep curiosity. And, D is to detach, which is to let go of your ABCs, assumptions, biases, and certainty. So if you can learn how to really challenge and interrupt those assumptions, biases, and not be so certain all the time. And, I talk about this concept I learned about called living in the perhapsness, admitting that, there is change, there is unknown, that there are things that we can be wrong about, just like Aristotle was wrong about, everything revolving around the earth. Like even the most brilliant people can be wrong, that can really help us to access deep curiosity. That's D. I is intend, which is what's your mindset going into, curious conversations with your teen or with your partner? Are you actually thinking about the questions that you're going to be asking? Are you thinking about, have you eaten? Have you slept well? Like, what's your state of mind before you get into that question? And then what's the setting? Are you in a really noisy subway trying to get curious with your coworker? Or are you, around a dinner table, in a safer environment where people feel like they can really be vulnerable and share, and they feel psychologically safe? V is to value, which is something, which is how do you see the dignity of the people you're being curious with, which includes yourself. And this was especially important because right now we're in this crisis of dehumanization. We are literally dehumanizing people because they stand on a different geopolitical crisis stance than us, than a different political stance than us, or they have different identities than us. And we can't ever be curious towards someone if we think that they're animals or savages or less than or unworthy. And so we have to start from this place of, I recognize your humanity. I recognize we both suffer. Like that is a part of
Yeah.
humanity.
Yeah.
And that is where we're going to open up deep curiosity. And the last is E, dive. E is embrace, which is how do you welcome the hard times in your life? Because it's during those moments of heartache, during those moments of grief, when you lose someone you love, even towards great, beautiful things in life, like getting married or having a child or children. These
Mhm.
can be hard moments of change. And that's especially when deep curiosity can bring you so much. It can help you to really get perspective from others who can help you on this, important moment in your life. Can help you to understand yourself, better, so that you can show up to those that you love.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's E, embrace. So there's DIVE, that's the dive motto. And there's all these different exercises that aren't just like write a list of questions. It's like
Yeah.
there's all of these different practices that you can do to, access deep curiosity.
Well, I want to go through. There's two I want to go through. We're not going to ask you to give away all the goods, right?
Yeah.
You got it in the book, and we'll talk about that. But the first one, detach,
Yeah.
and I'm curious on your thoughts on that because I'll never forget, and I've mentioned this a couple times on the show.
Mhm.
We interviewed a professor of ethics. I
Mhm.
should go pull up his name because I've quoted him a number of times. But I remember he told me, he said, I don't believe you should have opinions. And I remember thinking that's
Hmm.
so strange.
Hmm.
And I said, well, what about when you have to go vote? You got to. He said, yeah, then you use all of the non-judgmental information you have accumulated
Hmm.
and you form your opinion at the decision point. I'm
Hmm.
paraphrasing, right?
Hmm.
And there's I've clung to that. Now I don't know in all aspects, but because I find the value in you're summarizing it in this detached mentality.
Mhm.
If
Mhm.
you walk around guarding your opinions,
Mhm.
then I believe that you spend more time trying to prove them right than trying
Yep.
to question them.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
what do you see in people trying to practice this initial step in D? Like, do you notice people have a willingness to, or do you notice that they are sometimes unconsciously,
Yep.
uh, you know, attached to something?
Yeah, well, so there's this interesting research paper called "When in Doubt, Shout," and my understanding of that paper is that research is that when we are shouting the most, like getting vocal and arguing about topics, it's sometimes when we actually have a lot of doubt or a lack of understanding of that topic. And it makes sense to me because oftentimes experts, people who have spent their lives, studying something or learning about something, they're like, I have a lot more questions than I, came into this. Or like, wow, there's a lot I don't know. There's this level of both intellectual humility and, curiosity that comes from, learning about something for a really long time. And, the other piece is that when you are so certain about everything, I have all the answers, which is what I think a lot of leaders think they have to be, I
Mm,
have all the answers. I know where we need to go. All right, everyone, listen to me. We're going in this direction. That can actually create a sense of arrogance and a sense of certainty. It's not a likable character trait,
mhm.
in contrast, when you are intellectually humble and you're curious and you're like, the answers are within all of us. Like it's about unearthing those really surprising places where we might learn things. It's about having conversations and constantly being engaged with our communities and the world out there. That kind of intellectual humility and curiosity as a leader, we found in the research is it makes you feel more communal, more friendly, more likable, and rarely less competent, which is the fear that a lot of leaders have, is that
Mm,
if I'm not certain about everything, then people will think that I don't know what I'm talking about or I'm not competent. But the research shows that that's not true. You can be intellectually humble and curious and still be seen as extremely competent. And I think about my
sure.
own bosses and supervisors and leaders I admire. They are so curious, they are
Right.
so intellectually humble. And so that's a big part of it. And you look at systems, that we operate in the workplace or in society, it's like, wow, we, or even in education, we put so much reward on answers and
Mm,
knowing things and certainty. And rarely do we ever match that reward for questions and
mhm.
explorations. In fact, sometimes we might punish those things. Like, Billy, can you stop asking questions? You're like slowing us down right now, on this
Yeah.
project or in this class. We don't got time for this. You need to do this test. We have 45 minutes. I don't make the right. It's
Right.
a sort of mentality. And not, I have many teacher friends. So like, this isn't a dig at teachers. They're underpaid. They're an amazing workforce. Like we need to pay them more. We need to value them more, but this is, again, the system that they're in, right? I mean, education really needs an overhaul in many ways to reprioritize curiosity and value it in kids and in children, because the world that we're preparing them for is probably not going to look like what it's going to be by the time they're 18,
Exactly.
So, but if they have something like curiosity, they're going to always stay engaged with themselves and with the world. And if it's not just intellectual curiosity, it's also heart-centered curiosity, well, then they're also going to have this zest and this optimistic desire to want to know other people and who they are, even if they come from a different background than them or a different perspective than them. And also, curiosity isn't just about other people. I talk about the 3 directions of curiosity in the book. There's inward curiosity. How do you get curious about yourself? That's maybe what we do with our therapist. I have my therapist. So I do a lot of exploration of what's my story, what's the story I have in my head? What are my emotions I struggle to emote? Like anger, how do I better practice that? Where does that come from? That's all inward curiosity, learning about ourselves, which is an amazing place to explore, the inner world. And I've had to learn that as like an Enneagram 7. I'm like, oh my God, that's the last place I want to explore, but I'm like, wow, there's actually so much here that's so interesting. And then there's outer curiosity, which is a lot of what we're talking about. How do you get curious about people, the world? And then there's the beyond, which is how do you get curious about what's not in the physical realm, which to some of us is God and the divine, and to others is, consciousness or, our ancestors, descendants who are not yet born yet. What world will 7 generations from now inherit from us, and what can we do about that today to make it a little bit or a lot better for them? So that's the beyond. So there's, so much ground to cover with our curiosity, and it's really exciting and a beautiful, meaningful, way to live a life. So,
and as you were going through the inward, outer, and beyond, starting with the inward, I was thinking, why don't we do that more often? And my first response was, we might pawn it off as busyness, but it's more about, I don't want to necessarily say fear, but an unwillingness to understand self, almost viewing it as unnecessary, right? Lacking value. I don't know. Any thoughts on, why is that something we actually even have to be quote unquote taught? Or why is that something we have to talk about? You would think understand self is the most basic thing we want to do, but I don't think we do it often enough.
Yeah. And I don't think we're taught that, like in our culture, in our society, in our education systems. I was fortunate to have many mentors who reminded me, and my family, my mom and others who are, very introspective and thoughtful people in the world. But not everyone had that. And I think also, it's not just fear sometimes, it's not just time, it's also trauma. Some people have really scary, hard situations that they went through that psychologically and physiologically impact them in really debilitating ways. So, if you're a veteran that went through really harrowing experiences when, you were abroad, or, you were, a survivor of domestic violence, there's a lot of cases where trauma can hold you back from, getting curious about it, or to exploring it. And actually, if you explore it in a way that re-traumatizes you, that can actually be more harmful. So,
good point.
To have, psychological support and professional care and a clear structure to help you to get curious is really important for some people. And so I don't want to just say, everyone get inwardly curious, because that could open up a whole Pandora's box for some people. And unfortunately, we live in a world where many people have gone through traumas, and so whether, that trauma comes in many different ways. And for those who don't know, listening in, I'm not talking about like a broken bone that you can heal. It's, these experiences that we go through that, live in us, that we can't ever truly heal from, but we learn how to cope and live with, through, support and help. So that's I think there's a lot of limits and boundaries to curiosity that we don't often talk about. I mean, I did talk about that concert, I don't think we always should be curious. In that case with the homophobic men that were threatening
Yeah.
violence on me, that wasn't a moment for me to be deeply curious, right?
Right.
I had to set a boundary. I
Yeah.
talk about in the book a girl who had a prosthetic leg, and she put up a boundary with a boy that was asking all these questions to her about it and wanting to touch it.
Mm.
And she says, no, this is my body, like this, I get to make decisions about what you get to ask about and what makes me feel comfortable. Curiosity isn't deserved, it's
Mm.
earned, right, through
Mm.
trust in a relationship. Even in work, we have certain laws around what questions you can and can't ask
Right.
someone that you're interviewing, for instance,
Mm.
around like their pregnancy or something like that, right? And
Yeah.
like, and even if you're not hiring someone, there are certain questions that can be really invasive or uncomfortable, or maybe you're asking a question that's going to evoke a lot of trauma or a lot of suffering for someone, and that's not the kind of curiosity that I'm interested in.
Yeah. That's a
Yeah.
great point. What I am curious, I know you speak at a lot of organizations, and uh, what what do you find they are initially interested in regards to your work? Like,
Yeah.
imagine I'm a large tech firm,
Yeah.
right? And I want to bring you in because one of the buzzwords today is curiosity, because of what we've talked about. The world is changing and we need people to solve their problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine a lot of the things you talk about don't directly line up with their perspective of what curiosity is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when they call you in and say, "Hey,
Yeah.
Scott, come talk to us, come help us out," what is it usually that they're looking for?
Yeah. Well, it's like five dimensional. This isn't even 3D. We're like moving into the 5D. Someone told me
Yeah.
this recently, and it's the people that I talk to at these big companies, they need the language to share to decision makers or folks who want to bring me in. So, we know that curiosity can help with creativity, innovation, collaboration, helping to, navigate conflict, increase well-being, like all of these things that companies want. And so
Mhm.
that's what's communicated. But on the 5D level, like what we're really excited about underneath that,
Right.
is outside of the capitalistic structure is,
Yeah.
how do we give people more meaning, and how do we people feel like they matter and they're seen, they're heard, and they're valued? How do we help people have their spirits lifted so that inside of the office and when they go home, they can bring that good, great energy, to the people around them? I think that's what most people that bring me in, the people I talk to anyway, my points of contact, are really
Mm.
excited about. It's this
Mm.
human spirit work, right? And the corporation is just the vessel or the channel to get that done. And unfortunately, like it has to, oftentimes you have to use language that, gets someone in a decision-making, role really excited, and it will do those things. I mean, this
Yeah.
is all research backed. It will make your workforce more creative and more productive, et cetera. But for me, I have much more interest in,
Mhm.
healing and in connection and in helping people to have the tools that they can use in and out of the office, and the relationships that they, really care about. And even those that they don't yet have, strangers, neighbors, people that they walk by on the street within curiosity, whether that's someone who's unhoused or someone who is queer or trans or someone who votes differently than them. If it can even inspire them to ask a question or to take their curiosity a little bit deeper, to me, that's a big win. Yeah.
No, that makes sense. And so, just to be clear, so the idea is in the corporate setting, the decision maker, what we're getting them to understand is, if you have leaders who are more willing to understand those they lead,
Yeah.
then they will not only be able to lead more tactfully, I mean, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term,
Yeah.
but in addition, those that they lead will feel more supported. And we all know what happens when you feel more supported. You're willing to take risks and move with speed and all of those things. So, and there is a lot of truth to that. That's just not the only message.
Yeah,
And that's not
exactly.
okay. That
Yeah,
makes
exactly.
sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not the work that I was put on this earth that I feel like I'm supposed to be
You're
doing. Yeah,
not
yeah,
doing it so
yeah,
people make a higher margins,
yeah.
but
Exactly.
if
Yeah,
that's a
yeah, yeah, yeah,
byproduct and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
our
yeah.
way
If
of
that,
communicating with
yeah,
more people,
yeah.
that makes
If
sense.
that gets us on the door, if that creates the programs, if that's what energizes people, or even, when I talk about leadership,
Right.
that gets people in the door, gets them excited and motivated. And then they start to use these tools, not just in their workplace, but in their families and in
Yeah.
their communities. That's the really exciting part for me.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
On the topic of leadership, I'm sure you have been in conversation with a leader or leaders in general, if we just
Yeah.
want to generalize, that, you know, the idea of heart-centered curiosity, sure, it sounds good, it makes sense, but their willingness to do it
Yeah.
is not there, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying they're a bad person. It's just either not their temperament or they've got their own things they're dealing with, or, like, to be honest, I mean, middle management these days is
Mm-hmm.
just a kick in the balls just every
Mm,
day. Like, it's just
mm,
hard, right?
mm,
So
mm.
they don't have the capacity. In those instances, what is your goal with them? Is it to shift their thinking? Is it to try to change their
Yeah.
mind?
Yeah. So we know from the research that when you are curious, when people who are curious are put on their fMRIs, that we release dopamine, which is the happy hormone that we also release when we're eating a tasty meal or having sex. Who doesn't like those? Well, not everyone. There are asexuals. There are people who don't have a sense of taste. But for the most part, I
Most
think
people do.
most
Yeah,
people like
yeah,
those things.
yeah.
And dopamine does elicit this sense of enjoyment and pleasure. But I also just wanted to validate communities that also don't, strive for those things, which is totally perfectly valid.
Yeah.
But to also share that, when I think about going to the gym, going back to that metaphor, yeah, I don't ever want to sometimes go to the gym. I'm like, ugh, like that's not something I want to bring, into my day, or like
Good
there's
point.
other things I want to do. There's then spend an hour lifting things, in a room, or going for a run. Like right now, like sometimes I'm really jazzed about it. I'm like, all right, yes, I want to do this. But other times it feels like I really have to force myself to get into the gym or to get, outside to go
Mhm.
for that run. But when I do it, I feel so much enjoyment, so much meaning,
Mm,
so much growth, so much pleasure. And I just feel better. I feel healthier.
mm,
I feel
mm,
happier. And when I'm leaving the gym or I'm showering after my run, I'm so grateful that I gave myself that time. And the
mm.
same is true for curiosity. I totally understand. Sometimes you might feel really excited to get curious and you feel really jazzed, and other times, not so much. That's not what I want to do right now.
Right.
But know that if you do it, you put down that phone when your partner walks through that door and you ask them, those questions that you feel like maybe you don't have that energy for, or you ask your kiddo, like, oh, tell me why you feel like you had a bad day at school, or like why you did bad on that project, instead of saying, no, you did fine, like,
Right.
coming from that place of curiosity, putting in that energy, you'll find that you will open that door for connection. You'll feel so much closer. You'll feel this enjoyment and this meaning that wouldn't have been there had you been continuing to scroll on your phone, on IG Reels, So
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that is the helpful reminder for folks,
Mhm.
to, if you want a healthier and happier life, which most of us listening to podcasts like this
Yeah.
want. That's why
Yeah.
we do this. That's why we
Right.
listen to shows like this,
Yeah.
that there sometimes is a barrier.
Mhm.
And, just to get out there and do it. And remember the science of habit formation. Don't try to go and lift 200 pounds your first
Right.
time in. Don't go to the Trump rally, or don't go to the Biden rally. Like,
Right. Right.
don't start there. Please do
Yeah.
not start there. Start, in a way where you're thinking about what's the one thing I can do for 5 to 10 minutes. Maybe it's getting out of your house after a really wild day at work
Mhm.
and just being curious on your walk for 5 to 10 minutes with
Mm.
your senses. What are you seeing? What are you smelling? What are you feeling? The wind on your skin, and just
Mm.
giving yourself that 10 minutes to do a curiosity walk, it elicits awe, it elicits a sense of groundedness, and it helps you to realize, like, wow, I haven't left my house for a whole day or 2 days. I really
Yeah.
need to bring more of this into my life. I really need to reconnect to nature, and it starts to bring you back to yourself, and
Yeah.
that's, I think, the invitation. Yeah.
The idea of this going full circle to kind of where we started, right? And I asked you,
Mm-hmm.
do you think people can learn to be more curious? And obviously you were like, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the idea that, let's say you walk outside and you go, you know what? I don't know, be curious. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to intentionally do it. It's building the muscle in my mind of experiencing the world not from a state of knowing,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just
Mm-hmm.
not from a
Mm-hmm.
state of
Mm-hmm.
knowing, which is not our natural default.
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
adults, as kids, it is, but it's not as adults. Again, it takes less energy to be certain than it does to be curious.
Mm-hmm.
So, as energy efficient machines, to an extent,
Mm-hmm.
I realize I'm generalizing. our natural inclination as an adult is going to be to not have curiosity, because why expend that energy when unnecessary? So I like that idea of building that muscle.
Well, it's interesting too, because the research, a meta-analysis of multiple studies, over 1 million research participants, found that we actually get more curious over time. So this idea that,
Really?
curiosity is only for the kid, it is debatable. It's a hot debatable topic right now in research, because some folks are saying that it does decline over, especially into your older years. But there is this meta-analysis that says, no, actually you get progressively more curious. And for me, the way I'm interpreting the research is that, we maybe get more selective about our curiosity, right? So we're not verbally asking, why is Bluey blue? And why is this? And why are horses? And why do you,
right.
we ask different kinds of questions, maybe about spirituality, about our emotions, about our inner worlds, about, the beyond, like all of these kind of, questions we maybe are not asking, when we're younger. And also we're a little more selective too. We might not be interested in why Bluey is blue because we're focusing our curiosity in different ways. But I do think that, and we know from the research that curiosity is linked to lifespan. So the higher curiosity scores you have, the lower mortality rates you have, especially in older adults. And that makes sense. Like I said in the beginning of this conversation, talk to any elder, they'll say the minute you don't get engaged or active in your community, in your life, like wondering new things, getting involved, trying to teach yourself and grow and staying socially curious and connected to other people, is when you die, you stop living, So in that way, curiosity is not just love, it is life, literally. It is a force to love. If love is a verb, curiosity is a way to do that, like we've talked about in this conversation, but it's also to live, to literally extend your life. And so I do think that, we ought to, squash this idea that it's only for kids and only for artists. It's actually within all of us, just like creativity. I think this is another myth that we all hold around, like, I'm not curious, like they're artists but not me. Well, that's not true. There's so many different forms of creativity. You can think in systems, you can think in, creative problem solving. It's not just, can you draw a pretty picture? And who told you that you weren't creative or you weren't curious? Like, where did that start? Because someone should have told you that, probably told you that, or something in culture probably told you that you are not creative or you are not curious anymore.
I think it's probably that, right? As we were not that we'll get into it, but the education system alone, right? Is there's a specific way we define creativity, and if it's not that, or in your house or whatever, that's a great point.
Totally.
Well, Scott, I love it. The book's called Seek: How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. I think it's an interesting perspective on curiosity and the heart-centered approach. It makes a lot of sense around how it can help us connect with others by really being authentically curious about their journey and what's inside. And I think it's so much of what this podcast is built around. So for those listening, we've talked a lot about the theory of curiosity, and you did allude to not just the research, but some of the tangibles in your book. But there's a lot more. We started off with this idea of, can you teach it? And I think, you've made a good case for it. And if it's something you want to learn, the book's a great place to start. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to guide our listeners? Are there other places you're at where you're putting things out in the world about this concept?
Yeah, thanks for offering that. Slip into the DMs, I do listen and read to and look for all the private messages on social media or emails that come through my contact form. I love hearing from readers. And, I've actually heard from a bunch today that I was reading through, and how you're applying it at your family reunions or in your workplaces. And I want to help you and support you if that's what you need, or if you just want to share how you're doing that. That's why I became an author. I want to engage with the readers that are reading my book. Absolutely. So I really encourage you to not just read the book and, give it to folks who you think would love curiosity or need more curiosity in their life, but to also tell me about it too. And let's have a conversation, because I'm really curious too.
I love that. I love that. Scott, thank you so much.
Yeah, really thanks, Chris. Really appreciate you too.